Hi everyone, thanks for inviting us to present our research today, looking at how will fish communities in Gwich'in and Inuvialuit lakes respond to climate change. So I'm Alyssa and I'm presenting this work on behalf of my co-authors, Derek Gray, Sapna Sharma, and Jennifer Korosi. So first, a little bit of introduction. Climate change impacts on fish can be very complicated. So first, of course, it can impact warming water temperatures, but then there's also a whole range of indirect impacts that can affect fish. So for example, climate can impact the water quality in the lake. It can impact the water level, the stream connectivity. It can also impact the surrounding landscape. And it can increase the amount of species moving further north, and this can have more competition and predation with northern fishes. And then it can also impact the surrounding landscape via permafrost thaw, which in turn can impact fish habitat, and all of these things can combine in varied ways to influence northern fish. So in order to answer our main study question, how will fish communities in Gwich'in and Inuvialuit lakes respond to climate change, we first needed to break up our talk into two parts. So for the first part, we're going to be talking about this question here: what influences fish community health? And some examples of what could influence the fish community health include the water temperature, the water quality. This is looking at things like the nutrients or the water color, as well as lake size and connections to nearby rivers and lakes. But then when we started to look at our data and realized that water quality appeared to be quite important overall, we then took a step back and added a question to provide some greater context for what was going on with the fish in our study lakes. So our second question that we added aimed to look at this general question: what influences water quality? And I'm going to go over some more specific questions that we made up for this part of the study later in the talk. And first, I'm just going to focus on fish. So first of all, we came up to the Inuvialuit and Gwich'in lands and sampled 50 lakes over a 3-year period. And we used gill nets to capture fish, and we used short nets in order to reduce mortality on the fish in these study lakes. And then based on the data we collected there, we then looked at a few different indicators of community health. So these are some examples. So we looked at the total number of species that we captured in a lake. This is called species richness. We looked at the total catch per unit effort, and this gives us a sense of the abundance of the fishes in the lakes. And then we also looked at where we found specific species, or alternatively where they were not found, including northern pike, least cisco, and whitefish. And then we looked at a bunch of different potential drivers of fish community health. So the first few I've listed here. We looked at temperature. We looked at July air temperatures, which were used as an inference for water temperatures in our study lakes. We looked at the lake size, including the area and the depth. That was taken using our bathymetry measurements. And then we also looked at which lakes had very close connections to larger rivers or larger lakes nearby. And then we also collected water quality, of course, in our study lakes. So this included things like the amount of nutrients, the phosphorus or nitrogen concentrations, the chlorophyll A, which is a proxy for productivity or algae, the oxygen. We looked at the amount of dissolved organic carbons. So this tells you this tells you information about the water color in the lake. So for example, shown in the photo on the bottom here, you can see that there's a brown water color. So this would be indicative of more organic carbon. And also we looked at different measurements of the water clarity or transparency, measurements called the Secchi depth, and as well as turbidity in our study lakes. So our first research question looking at the fish was, what is currently driving fish community health in lower Mackenzie River Basin lakes? So I'm going to dive straight into the results here. If anybody has questions about the analyses, please feel free to reach out later or at the end of this talk. So the main takeaway that we saw were that water quality and lake size were the most important drivers of fish community health. So these results I'm showing you here were based on an analysis called a hierarchical partitioning analysis. And the main takeaway is that the color represents the different type of variable. So blue represents water quality variables, darker gray are the lake size, lighter gray is the connectivity, and the yellow orange color is July temperature. And this just reveals that the bluer and the darker gray made up the highest contribution to all of our different indicator models shown on the x-axis here. And then correspondingly, we saw limited evidence for temperature effects on fish, which was quite unexpected given the fact that temperature is often an important determinant for fish and where they're able to survive and how well they grow, etc. And also because some of the study lakes that we visited had temperatures higher than we thought that the cold water fish species in these lakes would prefer. And then here's an example of the general trends that we saw in some of our results. So this here I'm showing you is for species richness. And it's not the raw data, it's been converted because I'm showing you what's called a partial plot here. So I'm not going to get into the technical details, but the main takeaway is that we saw that smaller lakes that had poor water quality for fish, so they were browner and more nutrient rich, had less species in it, versus larger and clearer lakes had more species. And then we also found when we were looking at our results that one particular variable came out as being quite important for a lot of our fish community indicators, and that was dissolved organic carbon. So if you recall back, dissolved organic carbon is an indicator for the lake water color. So shown here in the photo, this is a lake that has very brown water color. And what we were finding was that fish diversity and abundance appeared to greatly decline when lakes were browner in color and less transparent, and that this decline occurred at a threshold, as shown on this plot here, just below 20 milligrams per liter. So why might water quality be such an important predictor in all of our results? So I'm going to pose a few different explanations. The first one here is that it can impact the water transparency, and this in turn could limit fish diversity and abundance in our study lakes. So what I mean by this is the amount, how transparent the water is limits the amount of light entering a lake. And if there's less light, this can impact the food available for fish. It can also impact their habitat. So a good example for this is northern pike, which is shown here on the right. So northern pike are a visual ambush predator, so they do need a certain amount of light in order to effectively catch their prey. And when there's less light, they can't do this as well. So it can impact their feeding and then their growth and then reproduction and survival. And another key point for pike is that they do rely, they like lakes that have lots of aquatic vegetation as shown in this photo here. So if there's less light entering a lake, then that type of vegetation cannot survive, and this can also impact pike. And then another possible explanation for water quality coming out as quite important in our models is the potential role of winter habitat and survival. So in many of these lakes that we looked at, they're quite small and shallow. So when the ice goes on in the winter, there's a certain amount of oxygen available in the lake, and that amount tends to decline over the winter period. So other studies have shown that when there are more nutrients or more DOC, which is dissolved organic carbon in the lakes, that this decline of oxygen can actually occur faster. So this could impact the survival of fish in those lakes and potentially be causing more winter kill or more fish to not be able to survive till the spring. So I think that this could be a fairly important avenue for looking at future research. All right, so moving into part 2, where we looked at the potential impacts of climate change or road use on water quality, looking at lakes within the greater region. So for this part, we first compiled water quality data from our study plus 4 previous studies. And so together we had a database of 203 lakes, and these studies ranged in time, with the earliest being in 1990 to ours being the most recent. And some were by the road and some weren't. And in particular, our study lakes were all along the highway corridor. And our study also had the highest number by far of lakes along the new Inuvik-to-Tuktoyaktuk highway. So we did a bunch of different analyses for this part, but the main takeaway here is shown in this plot. This is called a principal component analysis for people that are familiar with it. So the takeaway is that higher warming rates and road development, in particular the new highway, were associated with murkier lakes. And by murkier, I mean lakes that had poorer water quality for fish. They had more brown water color and higher nutrient levels, such as phosphorus. So bringing together our 2 sections to address our overall question, how will fish communities in Gwich'in and Inuvialuit lakes respond to climate change? Although there are certainly many limitations in our study, and particularly in the water quality section, based on what we know, we're predicting that climate change and resultant permafrost thaw could be leading to declining water quality, which may in turn be leading to lower fish community health in many Gwich'in and Inuvialuit lakes. However, this does paint a bit of a grim picture, but there are some important caveats that we can go over here. So first of all, our findings are based only on 50 lakes that were relatively small and shallow, so more research is needed in order to understand the greater implications for our study. Also, we do know that from lots of permafrost thaw research in this region that certain types of thaw, like retrogressive thaw slumping along lake shores, could in fact improve fish habitat, so we need to consider that in the greater picture of what might happen in the future. And also, larger and well-connected lakes appear to be more robust to climate change effects. So this is important, particularly as some of these larger lakes are the ones that are more important fishing spots. And then finally, of course, a lot of the fish in this region are migratory. So we only looked at the impacts during their lake residency. So in the future, what we should be looking at more are the range of different effects that they might experience over their life, because there's the potential for many benefits, including warmer and more productive conditions at sea with future warming. So the general takeaways here are that more monitoring and research to look at how fish diversity may be changing in rapidly changing permafrost landscapes will be really important, because our knowledge of this is still quite limited. And in particular, looking at these questions that arose out of our study, such as how new roads and infrastructure on permafrost may be impacting fish diversity indirectly, would be an important avenue for future research, as well as the potential role of changing winter habitat. And although there's not a whole lot that the communities can do to combat climate change at the global scale, there are some things that can be done locally. And we've identified one thing from our study, which is that the protection of larger and well-connected lakes may allow a better bang for your buck with conservation, because these may be more robust to future climate change impacts on fish. So with that, I just want to thank all of the various people and organizations that contributed to our work, in particular the Aurora Research Institute, the Gwich'in Renewable Resources Board, the various renewable resource councils, as well as the Hunters and Trappers committees, and financial support from the Northwest Territories Cumulative Impact Monitoring Program. So thanks everybody, and happy to take any questions.